Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Letting Go of Her podcast. First off, I want to say thank you to everyone who reached out to me after last week's episode about me quitting therapy. It was it was obviously a very emotional time for me, but also a very anxious time because I don't know. I guess I didn't know what to expect that day after. So I recorded that episode like within 10 minutes of me getting off my video phone call, whatever it's called, telehealth, I think is what it is. Um and I recorded it, and then I think I spent about like half of my day just like an anxious wreck, just like, heavy heart, or not heavy, but fast heart rate, and just like this like feeling of uneasiness, and obviously all the doubts and all the thoughts were going through my head, like, did I make the right decision? Am I going to regret this? What's going to happen? I like had to call a friend to just kind of help me distract my thoughts, right? Because I was like, I don't want to keep thinking about this, because if I do, I'm just going to spiral into who knows what and give myself who knows what kind of symptoms, right? And I don't want to feel like uncomfortable, right? Like, I'm already feeling somewhat uncomfortable from doing this. But I was also like an emotional wreck. I was like crying and crying a lot. And so once like the episode went away, I ended up being so exhausted, like exhausted to the point where like I was sitting on my couch with my son and he was playing with his toys, and I just like could not keep my eyes open. Like, that's how exhausted I was. Like, as if like I hadn't slept in days. Because when you have anxiety and your heart rate is going fast and your body is just running on adrenaline, like once that adrenaline runs out, like there's not your body has nothing else or nothing left to give. So I was exhausted. But luckily I was able to kind of eat a little bit of food, and then just like uh, you know uh, drink some. I have some green tea that I drink. It's like as much caffeine as my body can take. And so I just kind of dealt with that, and yeah, had to get right back on the horse, right? Like, I had to continue being a mom and being a wife and picking up my daughter from school and doing dinner and all that stuff. But then afterwards, I was able to talk to my husband about it once he got home, and kind of just process my thoughts. And he was like, I'm proud of you. He was the one who told me to go back, but then he also was the one who told me that I should quit because I didn't need it anymore. So yeah, that's kind of what it was. So thank you again to everyone who reached out. It was a whirlwind of emotions that day specifically, and I haven't really had much time to think about it again. But I'm sure that like maybe on the day where like I should have had therapy, I'm gonna be like, or something. I don't know. I hope not. But I do. Now that it's been a week, I do feel confident in my decision to stop going to therapy. But um, quitting therapy really made me think a lot about my anxiety and dealing with my anxiety. And, if I am being 100% honest, like, I am tired of dealing with anxiety. I get like annoyed when I'm anxious. And like, even though I know that I'm anxious, and even though I know like all these physical symptoms are coming from my anxiety, like, I can't stop it. I like, yeah. And when I'm like in it, I can prolong my symptoms for like hours, for days sometimes. And like, I try to keep reminding myself, like, it's just my anxiety, it'll go away. Like, if I just let it be, it'll go away. But somehow, like, my brain still wants to go over, I don't know, worst case scenarios, or go over every possible outcome, or whatever it is that I'm thinking about, whatever it is that I'm spiraling about. But I've really been thinking about like how can I combat this anxiety? Like, how can I make it stop, right? And I understand that anxiety is a normal part of life, right? Like, everyone feels anxiety at different points in their life. Um, like, certain things make you anxious. Like, everybody doesn't like talking publicly, right? So like, oh, of course someone's going to feel anxious about that. Um, or like a test. Some people don't do well on like tests. And like, anxiety is a normal part of life. Like, Jesus felt anxiety, right? He felt such bad anxiety that he was sweating out blood. um, but it's when you allow the anxiety to take over your life, um, that's when it becomes like debilitating anxiety, right? That's when it turns into what they call an anxiety disorder. And that is what I am honestly just like tired of dealing with. And it like just goes back to what I said last week about like you are the only one who's keeping you there. And I am still keeping myself there. So I've been really praying about it like this whole week basically. Um because I did quit therapy and I was like, okay, like I know that at points like my anxiety is going to come back. As it does or as it's always been, right? And then my brain goes like spiraling and it's like, well, it's because you quit therapy, right? It's going to get worse. But when I think about it, the reality of it is that my anxiety never stopped when I was seeing my therapist. So not saying that she didn't help or it didn't work, but it's not going to make a difference whether I see her every 2 weeks or talk to her every 2 weeks or not, because the anxiety was still there. I was still having panic attacks from time to time. Like seeing her and not seeing her did not make a difference. With those 6 months that I was dealing with really bad anxiety and panic, and then they kind of started subsiding a little bit. And then I started seeing her, but like they it was still there. Like the anxiety was still there, the panic attacks were still there. Like my therapist essentially did nothing to it. So that's what I like kind of keep reminding myself when I like start to think like, oh my goodness, like I'm not going to be able to survive without her, right? Because it was always there. Like it never realistically went away. So I've been praying about it for like this last week over like, Lord, like how can I make this go away, right? And I'm sure that any of you who have dealt with anxiety or have an anxiety disorder, we've all thought the same thing, or at least I hope so. Um, where it's like, what sin is still in my heart? What sort of darkness? What sort of like rock, like what is in my heart that I can't seem to let go and surrender to God so that I can free myself, and not even myself, but like so that the Lord can free me of this anxiety? Like what is it that I'm still holding on to? What is it that I'm still trying to do? What is it that I haven't fully put my trust in the Lord to make it that I'm still dealing with this anxiety? And I've been thinking about it. And yesterday I was cleaning my kitchen, and I was like, I was scrubbing my countertops and I was listening to the Bible app because I hadn't done my Bible reading for that day. Usually I do it in the mornings, but sometimes things happen, right? And so my husband took my son, my daughter was still in school, and so I was like, okay, perfect time for me to just like sit and like really just concentrate. And yesterday, coincidentally, was Numbers 4, and all it is just the repetitive over like the different tribes and the types of sacrifices that they have to make to the tabernacle and stuff. And so it wasn't much. I guess there wasn't much I could get from it. But as I'm cleaning and I'm cleaning and I'm just thinking over, I'm meditating over like what is being read through my headphones. But then I'm also like thinking like, Lord, like I don't want to be a prisoner of my anxiety anymore. Like please, please, please help me. Like why is it that I'm still dealing with this? Like I love you and I trust you, but for some reason it feels like what I want and what my body wants are like two different things. It feels like I don't even have control over this aspect of my body, right? Like I can say the words out loud. I can say, Lord, I trust you. But for whatever reason, my body and my brain don't feel the same way, right? And I'm like, so what can I do? Or like, what is going on? Like, please. And I'm literally just like begging. I'm just like, Lord, like, help me, right? Like, help me. And a verse came to mind, which is 2 Corinthians 12:19, which says, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." And at that point I was like, I get it. I get it. I feel that every one of us, we have a weakness, we have a sin, like the sin that we just continuously repeat over and over and over again, as much as like we declare how much we love the Lord, as much as we check all the boxes of how to be a good Christian, right? Going to church, reading my Bible, going to a small group, going, joining this, joining that, serving, like doing all of these things, right? But somehow there is something that we just can't simply stop doing, or there's something that we just can't simply let go of, something that is our weakness. And for me, my weakness is my anxiety. But that wasn't even the part that spoke to me the most. The part that spoke to me the most was, my grace is sufficient for you. And I kept thinking about that, right? And I kept trying to take it back to like anxiety. Like, what is anxiety? Anxiety is the fear of the unknown, right? That's basically what it is when your brain starts to think of all these different scenarios or all these different things, and you start to feel anxious over the unknown, over what you don't know, over what could possibly happen, over the future, over things that you have absolutely no control of. And that is what gives us the anxiety, or at least for me. But I'm pretty sure that that's that's kind of how it works for everyone, right? It's the fear of the unknown. So let me give like an example of like where I'm trying to go with this. You have a friend, and this friend, their spouse died, and you're seeing them living life, and you're watching them, and you see them struggling, but you also see them living, right? And you see them still going to church, and you see them still being involved, and you see them continuing their life, and you think to yourself like, man, like I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they would survive. Like if my spouse died, like I would be in shambles. Like I would not know how to survive, right? Like that's what we're thinking. But God says, my grace is sufficient for you. Meaning that because we haven't dealt with that, we don't have God's grace to deal with that. Does that make sense? God will give us grace whenever whatever uncertain circumstance comes into our life. He will always give us grace. That is his promise. And honestly, it's grace that we don't deserve. But he still gives us to that because he doesn't want us to suffer. But we're going to suffer regardless, right? But his grace makes it easier. His peace makes it easier, right? Knowing the ultimate outcome of everything, right? Is that we get to be with him in heaven. Like that makes it easier. So you might be thinking like, man, I wouldn't survive without my spouse, or I wouldn't survive if this happened to me, or I wouldn't survive if that happened to me. But look at them. They're still living. They're still doing it. That's because God has given them the grace to deal with whatever they have to deal with. And God will give you grace when you deal with whatever it is that you need to deal with. And I've noticed it in my own life, right? Like if I sit down with someone and someone asks me about my anxiety, and I tell them, oh, this, I feel this, or I feel that, or this happens to me, or that happens to me, right? And there are people, it's hard for me to believe, right? And it might be hard for you to believe, someone who might have an anxiety disorder, but it's hard to believe that there are people who don't feel anxiety as debilitating as we do. And that's weird because it's like, what do you mean you don't feel this? What do you mean you don't fear that? What do you? But there are people like that, right? And I've come across many people like that. And so I will talk to them about what my anxiety makes me feel, or what my anxiety makes me think, or what, whatever whirlwind my anxiety wants to take me. And all I hear from them is, man, like, that's rough, or man, that sucks. Like, man, I'm sorry, right? And in my head, I want to be like, what? Like, you don't feel this, right? But what I should really remember is that God gives me grace to deal with it. Oof, I just felt a conviction in my own heart, because there have been many times where I will be talking to someone about my anxiety and where they will be like, I've never felt that, and I've never experienced that, right? Like, they don't need to necessarily say those words. But in my head, every single time I think, God, like, why me? Like, God, like, why do I have to deal with that? Like, God, why can't I just be normal, right? Like, why am I the one who has to have this and feel this and do all that? Like, why me? Like, why me? Like, I don't want to. But I need to remember that God has chosen this path for me for whatever reason it is, and that God will grant me his grace every single time I'm feeling anxious and every single time I'm having a panic attack. And that will be sufficient enough for me to move past it. I remember a few months ago, I had what we all thought was a medical scare, which turned out to be nothing extreme. But basically, I got misdiagnosed from one doctor, which then sent me to the ER. And yeah, so they thought I had appendicitis. And so they rushed me over to the ER. They're like, you need to go now, right? And whatnot. And I was scared. I was like, oh man, like I wasn't really prepared to have surgery today. um, and so I packed a bag like really quickly, just like, okay, I'm going to need some loose pants because obviously they're going to cut through my abdomen and that's going to hurt. And I've had 2 C-sections, so I know what that feels like. And I'm like, and I'm going to pack my toothbrush, right? And I'm like, I guess that's it. Like, maybe some deodorant. Let me make sure that my Kindle is charged and let me bring a phone charger, right? And I'm like, let me add in a few books or something. I was like, I don't really know. And so I was scared. But then we get to the ER and they're, whatever, checking me and stuff. And I could see that my husband was anxious and he was like not trying to say anything. He was trying to be brave and strong for me. Because he knew that if I saw him freaking out, then I would freak out more. But I remember at that moment, like, praying over my husband. I wasn't praying over myself, right? I wasn't praying like, God, like, help me survive this surgery, or like, God, have it be something else, like, God this, God that. Like, I wasn't praying over myself. I was praying over my husband. I was like, God, give him the peace. Give him your grace. Like, God, help him see that he is strong enough to deal with some emergency surgery that I apparently have to have right now. And praying for him gave me the ultimate peace. And even when the doctors were checking me, and even when, they were like, oh, this and that, right? Like, I had God's grace. I had God's peace. I wasn't anxious. And I am an anxious wreck every time I go to the doctor's office. Don't ask me what my blood pressure reading is every time I go, because it is through the roof. But I was fine. Was I a little scared? Sure, right? Because I didn't really know what to expect. But I had God's grace with me. And you might be thinking like, what? Like, if someone told me I had to get surgery like right away, like, I would be freaking out. Like, yeah, I know. But that's because you're not gonna have emergency surgery right now. So you don't have God's grace right now. I hope these points that I'm making are making sense. God's grace would be sufficient enough for you in whatever circumstance and whatever trial that the Lord is putting you through. He will give you his grace. So no, I didn't end up needing to have appendicitis. Appendicitis is what it's called. But no, I didn't need to get my appendix removed. Yeah, it turned out to be something totally different, and something that unfortunately there's nothing we can do about it. So from time to time I feel a little bit of pain. But you know what? God gives me his grace every time I feel that pain, right? And there's no need for me to be anxious because, one, I already know what it is. But two, I can trust that the Lord will see me through it, because the Lord saw me through it then, and he will see me through it every single time. I apologize if the sound is off now. My microphone just died on me, but I am on a roll, so I don't want to stop recording this and then come back when it's charged, because then I'm going to forget my train of thought or forget the point that I was making. So forgive me for the sound coming off right now. But the point that I wanted to make, connecting anxiety with my grace being sufficient, is that anxiety always lies to us, and anxiety always makes us come up with these extremely unrealistic scenarios, right? Because we want to be in control. That's exactly what anxiety is. Anxiety is a sin of wanting to be in control. It's saying that God can't control everything. It's saying that you can control your life better than God can. And that is a harsh reality. I know we don't want to think that way, because I feel that I have a good walk with God, right? But when someone says, well, your anxiety is you not trusting God, like that stings a little bit, because it's like, but I do, right? And like I've said, it's as if I say something, but my body is telling me something else. And that I don't have control over how my body wants to react to things, but I do have control over how I want to react to things. So though maybe at times we can't stop what our brain is saying, we can't stop where our brain is going, we can't stop our brain from thinking of all these millions, thousands of scenarios that are never realistically ever going to come true. What we can remember and we can tell our brains is that even if that happens, even if this happens, even if I am somehow like stranded in Antarctica and like, how am I going to survive, right? God's grace will be sufficient enough for me. His power is made in perfect weakness, which means that through your weaknesses is where God shows you his greatest power. So don't try and push them away. If anything, embrace them a bit. Know that those weaknesses are where it's going to show you God's true love, God's true grace. And know that in those weaknesses that we have, sometimes we have them for a reason. And we might not know why, we might not understand, we might never know why in this life. But I'm going to trust that God knew this plan for my life, that God knew that somehow I needed to be dealing with this, that God knew that I would be the perfect person to be dealing with this, to somehow turn it around and show his glory. And I pray that even when my friends, even when my family, even when people from church, even when those around me see my weaknesses, they can see my love for God and my trust for God. Because even when I'm struggling, even when I'm down, even when I'm so anxious, even when I'm having a panic attack, that they see that I keep my eyes on Jesus. Because his grace is sufficient for me to survive whatever it is that he wants me to deal with for his plan, all to show him the glory. So my prayer for today is for anyone who is dealing with some hardship. It doesn't have to be anxiety. It could be anything. Maybe something you've been dealing with all your life and you don't know why, right? You keep thinking like, God, I'm worshiping you. I'm praising you. I'm trying to glorify you, but somehow I'm still struggling with this. Know that his grace is sufficient. Know that his power is made in weaknesses. Know that through your weaknesses, he's going to show his greatest power to you. And what an amazing thing. Like, how much love does God have for us? That he uses everything and anything to turn it around so that we can glorify him, even in our good, but mostly in our bads. So today I am learning to let go of my need or my fear of thinking that if something goes wrong, I won't be okay. Because whatever happens, God will give me his grace, and God will give you his grace to bring us peace. Because I am a new creation.